Saskatchewan teachers consider new offer from government. New tailings are mixing with old tailings, making an even more toxic poison at Grassy Narrows. The Canadian Medical Association warns that taxing the rich will damage Canadian healthcare. Cacao farmers in Côte d'Ivoire make nearly nothing, while chocolate companies make hundreds of billions in profits. And the UK is off to the polls. Good morning. It's Friday, May 24th. It's Friday. I'm Nora, coming to you still from Regina. Here are your headlines. First to Saskatchewan, where the Saskatchewan Teachers Federation is reviewing the latest offer from the province. For 2 days, they've held virtual town halls with their members to go over it. CTV News' Caitlin Brzezinski reports that the STF says that the government has budged on compensation, classroom complexity, violence in the classroom, and other issues. The province would release $18 million more per year to help deal with classroom complexity, and they would create a minister's task force on classroom complexity. They also want to create something called, quote, a policy table on violence-free classrooms, unquote. As for raises, the teachers are being offered 3%, 3%, and 2% over 3 years for a total of 8%. To give you an idea of what public sector workers in Quebec won, most were able to secure 17.4% increases over 5 years. The STF has accepted to put the agreement to its members, and teachers will vote on it May 29th and May 30th. The article quotes professor and all-around good guy Charles Smith, who questions whether or not the latest offer is actually all that good. Certainly, the promise of policy tables means nothing but delays, and many of the issues that teachers have been fighting for will remain unaddressed. But he does suggest that maybe the leadership is taking this to the membership with the hope that they'll reject it. That would put the bargaining team in a better position to reject the offer. But it's a huge gamble. Also, it's possible that the bargaining team thinks that this is the best deal that they can get. Next to Asapichasiwagong Netam Anishinabek, also known as Grassy Narrows in northwestern Ontario, where a new study shows that new industrial activity has released even more severe poisons into the English Wabigoon River than had been released before. This is coming from Sarah Law from CBC News. The river had been contaminated from decades of pulp and paper industry activity. Mercury poisoning has impacted several generations of people who rely on the river for fish. Now, it looks as if the discharge coming from the Dryden paper mill has mixed with mercury that's still in the river system and has created methylmercury, which is more toxic than mercury alone. The mill was operated by Domtar up until last August, when Dryden Fibre Canada took over. As many as 90% of the near 1,000 people who live at Grassy have symptoms of mercury poisoning. Next, from the Department of Rich People's Problems, remember how in the last budget the government promised to increase the capital gains inclusion rate from 50% to 66.7%? Well, the Canadian Medical Association is saying that doing this will, quote, put at risk its own healthcare agenda, unquote. Now, you might wonder how on earth taxing Canada's super rich a little bit more and therefore bringing in more revenue for the government to use to pay for healthcare could cause harm to the healthcare system. But then you probably don't have a Canadian Medical Association brain. Dr. Catherine Ross argued that by not allowing doctors to avoid paying more tax, it will scare people out of being doctors. You know, I've always heard from people who dream about becoming a doctor that they do so just so they can pay the 50% of capital gains inclusion, not 66.7. Now, think about your own salary. How much of it is taxed? Well, it's taxed at 100%. All the income you make is subject to tax. But for the people in Canada who make money off of capital gains, which can be the profit they make over and above selling a property or stocks, they don't have all their income taxed. And because doctors are actually corporations, Ross argues that this will harm doctors' ability to save for vacations or sick leave because they don't get benefits. Ross should be arguing for a 100% inclusion rate and a public pension program for doctors, if she actually cared about doctors' pensions, of course. Ross also could call for free tuition fees to stop the ridiculous practice of saddling doctors with hundreds of thousands of dollars in student loans, but she doesn't. She just uses those loans as a justification for paying lower tax. And here's an amazing line, quote, Canadian physician Dr. David Poon, who started a Facebook group called Professional Corporation Advocates, told Global News in April that the capital gains change is, quote, essentially a tax on our savings, unquote. Yeah, buddy, savings are taxed. Don't you know how it works down here for the little people? Anyway, Global News, kind of a bad article because it only gives the perspective of these doctors that are threatening Canadians who are already worried about the state of their healthcare system, and doesn't actually include any sober voices saying, wait a minute, do we know how much money we're talking about here? Next to international news, and first to Côte d'Ivoire. A feature at Al Jazeera examines how difficult harvesting cocoa has become for local farmers. Cacao is extremely sensitive to weather patterns. Both Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana harvest the world's most cacao and have both been hit very hard this year by El Niño. Drier and hotter temperatures have impacted rain, and with that, in some places, farmers are producing half of the cacao they used to produce in the past. While the market's volatile pricing has led to huge profits for chocolate companies, the farmers are often destitute. One farmer, Christian Kouassi, said this, quote, we have absolutely no say in the price of the fruit we produce. This has to change somehow. As a union, we're concerned with making cacao more sustainable and producing in a way that benefits the community, unquote. The governments of Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana have tried to raise prices by creating a premium of $400 per ton to give farmers a guaranteed minimum income regardless of price fluctuations. Farmers are hopeful that they can move that amount even higher. The global chocolate market is worth some $119.39 billion. Billion with a B. The largest company is Mars Wrigley Confectionery, and they have profits of $22 billion. After them, Ferrero Group and Mondelez made more than $10 billion in profits each. And finally, it feels like the Brits have not been to the polls in ages. Well, yesterday, the election campaign was kicked off, and they'll be voting in 6 weeks. The Conservatives have been in power for 14 years and are running as the underdogs as their popularity has tanked. Rishi Sunak called the election earlier than was planned. The Labour leader, Keir Starmer, I know, his name sounds like a Nazi-era magazine, is poised to win. Sunak has promised to, quote, take bold action, unquote, including to finally implement his plan to deport people who arrived in the UK as migrants to Rwanda. There are 650 seats in the House of Commons. The Associated Press reports that the Liberal Democrats will be nipping at the Conservatives' heels in South and Southwest England, and the far-right Reform UK party will be nipping at their heels in industrial parts of the country. Those are your headlines for Friday, May 24th. I'm Nora. You're listening to this podcast at sandynora.com, on the Real News Network podcast feed, and anywhere you get your podcasts. It's Friday. I hope you have a wonderful weekend, and I'll talk to you on the other side.